Hello, sweetheart. My name is Ruth, and if you have ever pulled a warm loaf of bread out of the oven and thought it just did not taste the way you remembered, I want you to know something. You are not imagining it. The bread we eat today is not the same bread your grandmother made. It is not even close. And I am not just talking about some fuzzy feeling of nostalgia either. The wheat is different. The process is different. The ingredients are different. A loaf of white bread sitting on a supermarket shelf in 1974 and a loaf sitting on that same shelf today are almost two completely different foods. That was 1974. By the time we reached the 2000s, the bread aisle had become something my mother would not have recognized at all. So what actually changed? What happened between my mother's kitchen and the plastic-wrapped loaf in your pantry right now? That is what we are going to walk through together today, step by step, because once you understand what went wrong, you also understand how to fix it, and it is easier to fix than you might think. If you had walked into my mother's kitchen in rural Pennsylvania back in 1952, you would have found flour, water, salt, and a little bit of yeast. That was it. 4 ingredients on the counter next to a worn wooden cutting board, a mixing bowl, a tea towel, and about half a day of patience. She would have laughed if you told her bread needed 20 ingredients and a chemistry degree. She had no idea what was coming. My mother kept her flour in a tin canister with a red lid. The flour smelled like wheat, like something alive, because in many ways it still was. It came from a local mill about 40 minutes from our house, and that mill ground the grain slowly between stones. She did not know the science behind it at the time, but that slow grinding kept the germ and the bran partly intact, and those are the parts of the wheat kernel where most of the flavor and nutrition live. The flour had a faintly golden tint to it, not the bright bleached white you see in bags today. If you scooped up a handful and let it fall through your fingers, it felt slightly coarse, almost silky, and it left an oily trace on your palm from the wheat germ. When she mixed that flour with warm water and a pinch of yeast, she would set the dough aside and let it rise for hours. Sometimes she would punch it down and let it rise again overnight. She would cover it with that same tea towel and set the bowl near the wood stove where it stayed warm but not hot. The dough was not in a hurry, and neither was she. My mother taught me this, and I want you to understand what that time was actually doing, because it matters more than almost anything else in this whole story. When bread dough sits and ferments slowly, wild bacteria and yeast begin breaking down the starches and proteins in the flour. They produce lactic acid and acetic acid, which are the same compounds that give sourdough its tang. They create dozens of flavor compounds, little organic molecules called esters and aldehydes, that your tongue registers as depth and complexity. A loaf that fermented for 12 or 14 hours had a flavor that you could actually taste with your eyes closed and identify as bread, real bread. The crust crackled when you broke it. The inside was chewy but tender, not cottony, not spongy. It went stale in a day or two because there was nothing artificial keeping it soft, and when it did go stale, you made French toast or bread pudding, and that was that. Nothing was wasted. The whole neighborhood smelled like baking bread on a Saturday morning, and if you have ever smelled that, real flour and yeast doing their work in a hot oven, you know it is a smell you never forget. This was just the way we used to do it, and it worked beautifully for a very long time. Now here is where this story starts to change, and it begins not in a kitchen, but in a laboratory. During the 1940s and 50s, a plant scientist named Norman Borlaug was working on a project that would eventually feed billions of people and win him the Nobel Peace Prize. He developed new varieties of wheat that grew shorter and stockier. These dwarf wheat plants put more energy into producing grain and less into growing tall stalks. The yields were extraordinary. Fields that once produced a modest harvest were suddenly overflowing, and for countries facing famine, this was a genuine miracle. They called it the Green Revolution, and it saved countless lives across Mexico, India, and Pakistan. I do not say a single unkind word about the man or his mission. Feeding hungry people is sacred work. But here is what happened to the bread. These new wheat varieties were bred for one thing above all else, and that was how much grain they could produce per acre. Nobody was selecting for flavor. Nobody was selecting for the kind of protein structure that makes a loaf rise slowly and develop complex taste over time. The older heritage varieties, wheats with names like Turkey Red and Red Fife and Marquis, had a different gluten profile. Their proteins were softer, more extensible. They worked beautifully with slow fermentation because the gluten stretched gently and trapped gas over many hours. The new dwarf wheats had tighter, stronger gluten. That made them easier to process in high-speed machines, but it also meant the flour behaved differently in a home kitchen. The dough felt different in your hands. The bread tasted different on your tongue. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. By the late 1950s, the older wheat varieties were already disappearing from commercial farms across North America and Europe. Farmers planted what paid, and the new high-yield cultivars paid better. The heritage grains that had fed families for generations were quietly replaced, and hardly anyone outside the farming community noticed. The flour on the grocery store shelf looked the same. The bag said the same thing. But the wheat inside that bag had changed at the genetic level, and it was about to meet a machine that would change bread forever. I want to give you a specific example so this does not feel abstract. Turkey Red wheat came to Kansas in the 1870s with Mennonite immigrants from Russia. It thrived on the plains and became the backbone of American bread flour for decades. The protein in Turkey Red was moderate, around 11 to 12%, and it developed gluten slowly and gently. Bakers loved it because it made a loaf with real structure and real chew without being tough. By the 1970s, Turkey Red had been almost entirely replaced by modern varieties with higher yields and different protein characteristics. The same thing happened to Red Fife in Canada and to Emmer wheat across Europe. These were not inferior grains. They were grains that required patience, and patience was exactly what the industry was about to throw away. In 1961, researchers at the British Baking Industries Research Association in a small town called Chorleywood, England, invented a process that would reshape the entire commercial bread industry. They called it the Chorleywood bread process, and the idea behind it was simple but radical. Instead of letting dough ferment slowly for hours to develop gluten structure and flavor, you could blast it with intense mechanical energy in a high-speed mixer for about 3 minutes. The machine did in 3 minutes what time used to do in 12 hours. You add extra yeast, some hard fat, chemical oxidants, and a handful of enzymes and emulsifiers, and you have a loaf of bread from flour to wrapped on the shelf in under 4 hours. The engineers behind this process were trying to solve a real problem. Britain imported most of its high-protein bread flour from Canada, which was expensive. If they could figure out a way to make acceptable bread from weaker British flour, it would save the country millions of pounds a year. And the Chorleywood process did exactly that. The high-energy mixing forced the gluten to develop mechanically, which meant you no longer needed strong flour or long fermentation. You just needed electricity and speed. I want you to think about that for a second. Bread that used to take the better part of a day was now produced in less time than it takes to watch a movie. For the baking industry, this was a dream come true. Production costs dropped. Output skyrocketed. A single factory could pump out thousands of identical loaves every hour, each one exactly the same size, shape, and weight as the one before it. Consistency became the goal, not flavor. And because the process worked with lower protein wheat, countries like Britain that could not grow the hard wheat needed for traditional bread making could suddenly use their own domestic flour. Within a decade, the Chorleywood process was producing roughly 80% of all the bread sold in the United Kingdom. Other countries followed quickly. Australia, New Zealand, India, parts of South America, all adopted variations of the same system. The United States had its own version of industrial speed baking already in place through large commercial bakeries like Wonder Bread, and the two systems reinforced each other across the Atlantic. By the 1980s, the handmade loaf was the exception, not the rule, in almost every developed country on earth. But that speed came at a cost, and the cost was everything that made bread taste like bread. When you skip slow fermentation, you skip the part where bacteria produce those lactic and acetic acids. You skip the enzymatic breakdown that unlocks flavor from the starch. You skip the slow, patient development of gluten that gives bread its chewy, satisfying texture. What you get instead is a loaf that is soft, uniform, slices neatly, and stays spongy on the shelf for a week. It is engineered to feel pleasant in your mouth, but to deliver almost no real flavor. That is why if you close your eyes and chew a piece of modern supermarket white bread, you taste something closer to sweetened cotton than to an actual grain. And the industry did not stop at just speeding up the process. Once you take the slow road out of bread, you need to put something back in to make it look and feel like bread should. That is where the additives come in. Modern commercial bread in the United States routinely contains emulsifiers like sodium stearoyl, lactylate, and mono and diglycerides, which keep the crumb soft and prevent staling. It contains dough conditioners like calcium sulfate, ammonium chloride, and azodicarbonamide, which is a chemical also used in the production of yoga mats and shoe soles. I want you to sit with that one for a moment. A chemical that helps make the foam rubber in yoga mats is also in the bread your children eat for lunch. It is approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, but it is banned in the European Union and Australia. It contains preservatives like calcium propionate to prevent mold, which means a loaf can sit on a shelf for 2 weeks without growing a single spot of green. My mother's bread would have been halfway to croutons by then. Many American breads also contain added sugar, sometimes listed as high fructose corn syrup, to feed the yeast faster and give the bread a slightly sweet flavor that American consumers have been trained to expect over decades of eating this way. If you grew up on this bread, you think bread is supposed to taste a little sweet. It is not. That sweetness is added, and your grandparents would not recognize it. Look at the ingredient list on a loaf of standard white bread at any American grocery store, and you will count 15 to 20 ingredients, sometimes more. My mother would have needed a dictionary for half of them. And no, I am not making that up. Walk into any supermarket, pick up the first loaf you see, and flip it over. You will find a paragraph of ingredients where there should be 4 words. Meanwhile, a loaf of bread in a traditional French bakery still contains flour, water, salt, and yeast, because French law actually prohibits adding most of those chemicals to bread. The law is called the Bread Decree of 1993, and it sets strict standards for what can be labeled as bread in France. We did not do that here. We let the industry decide what bread was, and the industry decided that bread was whatever could be made fastest and cheapest and shipped farthest without going stale. Now, I want to explain the science part of this in a way that makes sense, because once you understand what slow fermentation actually does, you will never look at a bag of sandwich bread the same way again. When flour and water are mixed together and left to sit, naturally occurring bacteria in the flour, mainly strains of lactobacillus, begin to wake up and feed on the starches. These bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid as byproducts, and those acids do several critical things. First, they lower the pH of the dough, which changes the way proteins interact and creates a stronger, more flexible gluten network. Second, they break down phytic acid, which is a compound in wheat that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and calcium and prevents your body from absorbing them. Bread made with long fermentation is actually more nutritious than bread made quickly, because the slow acid process unlocks minerals that would otherwise pass right through you. Third, and this is the part my mother understood without ever reading a study, slow fermentation produces flavor, real flavor, the kind you cannot fake with additives. Over the course of 12 to 18 hours, those bacteria and yeasts generate hundreds of volatile aromatic compounds, alcohols, esters, organic acids, aldehydes, These are the same families of molecules that give aged cheese its depth and wine its complexity. You cannot rush this process. 3 minutes in a high-speed mixer does not produce these compounds any more than shaking a bottle of grape juice turns it into wine. Time is the ingredient, and the modern baking industry took time out of the recipe. This is also why so many people who struggle with wheat sensitivity find that they can eat traditionally fermented sourdough bread without the same discomfort. The long fermentation partially breaks down the gluten proteins and the fermentable sugars called FODMAPs that cause digestive trouble for a lot of people. It is not that the wheat disappears, it is that the bacteria have already started digesting it for you, the same way our great-grandmother's bread dough was pre-digested by time and microbes before it ever went into the oven. Researchers at Monash University in Australia have published studies showing that sourdough bread made with a traditional long fermentation measured significantly lower in FODMAPs than the same bread made with commercial yeast and a fast rise. The bread is not magic, the process is. There is one more piece of this story that matters, and it is about what happened to the flour itself. Even setting aside the changes in wheat genetics, the way we mill flour changed dramatically in the late 1800s with the introduction of steel roller mills. Stone mills crush the whole kernel slowly, keeping the germ oil distributed throughout the flour and retaining some of the bran fiber. Roller mills are faster and more efficient, but they separate the wheat kernel into its component parts. The starchy endosperm becomes white flour. The germ and bran are stripped away and often sold separately as animal feed. What remains is a fine, white, shelf-stable powder that is missing most of the vitamins, minerals, and oils that were in the original grain. The government recognized this problem in the 1940s, which is why most white flour in the United States is now enriched, meaning a handful of synthetic vitamins are sprayed back onto the flour after processing. But enrichment replaces maybe 5 of the more than 20 nutrients that were stripped out. It is like taking the engine out of a car, bolting a lawnmower motor under the hood, and calling it restored. If you have been listening to all this and thinking that it sounds like the food industry decided to trade flavor and nutrition for speed and profit, well, you are right. That is exactly what happened. And I am not angry about it because I understand why it happened. After the Second World War, populations boomed, cities grew, and feeding everyone cheaply and quickly became the priority. Nobody sat in a boardroom and said, "We are going to make bread taste worse on purpose." They said, "We need to make more bread faster," and they found a way to do it. But the consequence, whether they intended it or not, was that bread went from being one of the most nourishing and flavorful foods a family could make to being a soft, bland, preservative-filled delivery system for sandwich meat. And a whole generation grew up thinking that was just what bread was. The good news, and I always like to end with good news, is that you can get back to real bread. You can do it in your own kitchen with the same tools my mother used. She did it every week with nothing but flour, water, salt, and a little yeast. And you can do the same. You do not need a bread machine. You do not need special equipment. You need a bowl, your hands, an oven, and about 20 minutes of active work spread out over a long, lazy rise. If you want to start simple, try this. Mix 3 cups of flour with 1 1/4 cups of warm water, a teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. Stir it together until it forms a shaggy dough. Cover it and leave it alone for 12 to 18 hours at room temperature. The next day, shape it gently on a floured surface, let it rest for another hour or 2, and bake it in a preheated Dutch oven at 450 degrees for about 30 minutes with the lid on and another 15 with the lid off. That is essentially the recipe that Jim Leahy made famous at Sullivan Street Bakery in New York City, and it works because it gives time back to the bread. The long, slow rise does all the work that kneading and machines try to shortcut. When you pull that loaf out and crack the crust open and smell what comes rising up, you will understand exactly what I have been talking about this whole time. That is bread, That is what it is supposed to taste like. If you want to go even deeper, you can keep a sourdough starter. A sourdough culture is just flour and water that you feed regularly, and the wild yeast and bacteria that live naturally in the flour colonize it over the first week or two. You mix equal parts flour and water in a jar. Leave it on the counter and feed it once a day by discarding half and adding fresh flour and water. Within 5 to 7 days, it will start bubbling and smelling pleasantly sour. Once you have an active starter, you never need to buy commercial yeast again. You mix your starter with flour, water, and salt. You let it ferment for 8 to 12 hours, sometimes longer. You shape it, let it proof, and bake it in a hot oven, ideally with a Dutch oven or a heavy-covered pot to trap steam and give you that crackling crust. My mother never called it sourdough. She just called it bread. But the process was the same one people have used for thousands of years. If you are not ready to bake at home, pay attention to labels. Real bread has a short ingredient list. Flour, water, salt, yeast, maybe a little olive oil or honey. If you see a list of words you cannot pronounce, put it back. Look for bakeries in your area that do a long fermentation and ask them about it. Real bakers are proud of their process, and they will tell you exactly how they make their bread. You can also seek out heritage grain flour from small mills. Companies and farms across the country are growing and milling varieties like Turkey Red, Red Fife, Sonora White, and Emmer, which is one of the oldest cultivated wheats on earth. These flours behave differently from the all-purpose flour you are used to, but that difference is the point. They have more flavor, more color, more personality. Baking with them is like cooking with heirloom tomatoes after a lifetime of eating the pale pink ones from the supermarket. You realize what you have been missing. Now, before I let you go, I want to tell you something about why this matters to me personally. I am not a scientist. I am not a baker by trade. I am a grandmother who grew up in a kitchen where bread was made by hand, the way it had been made for thousands of years. When my mother mixed flour and water and set it aside to rise, she was doing the same thing that women and men in ancient Egypt did 6,000 years ago along the banks of the Nile River. Bread is one of the oldest human foods. It fed the Roman legions. It sustained families through wars and famines and depressions. It connected us to the land, to the seasons, to the rhythm of our days. Every culture on earth has some version of bread, from the naan in Indian clay ovens to the tortillas pressed on stone in Mexico to the dark rye loaves of Scandinavia. And in every one of those traditions, time and patience were part of the recipe. When we handed that process over to factories and machines and chemical engineers, we lost something real, not just flavor, not just nutrition. We lost a connection to the way food is supposed to be made, slowly, simply, with care. We lost the smell of Saturday morning. We lost the satisfaction of tearing open a loaf you made with your own hands and knowing exactly what went into it. We lost something that cannot be measured in bushels per acre or loaves per hour. My mother always said that bread tells you when it is ready. You cannot rush it. You can only pay attention. And I think there is a lesson in that for all of us, not just about bread, but about the way we live. I would love to hear from you. If your family had a bread recipe that was passed down, or a way of doing things in the kitchen that the old folks taught you, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and those family tips are worth more than anything you will find in a cookbook. And if you found this helpful, a like and a subscribe would mean the world to me. I will be right here with more of this kind of thing, the way we used to do it, backed by the reasons it worked so well. Thank you for spending this time with me. Now go bake some bread.